Question 1. The performance metrics show a consistent increase in client complaints regarding settlement delays. A buyer's agent in Maryland is representing a client whose closing is unexpectedly postponed due to an issue with the title search. The buyer is becoming increasingly frustrated and is demanding immediate action and an explanation. What is the most appropriate course of action for the agent to take? Option A. Inform the buyer that the delay is solely the responsibility of the title company and that the agent cannot intervene further. Option B. Offer to personally cover some of the buyer's unexpected expenses incurred due to the delay to appease them. Option C. Immediately contact the buyer, explain the nature of the title issue, outline the steps being taken to resolve it, and provide an updated estimated closing date, while also coordinating with the title company and seller's agent to expedite the resolution. Option D. Advise the buyer to wait and see if the title company can resolve the issue on their own, as direct involvement might complicate matters. The correct answer is C. Immediately contact the buyer, explain the nature of the title issue, outline the steps being taken to resolve it, and provide an updated estimated closing date, while also coordinating with the title company and seller's agent to expedite the resolution. Explanation. The performance metrics show a pattern of increasing client complaints regarding delays in closing real estate transactions in Maryland. This scenario is professionally challenging because it directly impacts client satisfaction, the brokerage reputation, and potentially the agent's commission earnings. Navigating these disputes requires a delicate balance of adhering to Maryland real estate law, ethical obligations, and effective communication to resolve issues promptly and fairly. The best approach involves immediate, transparent communication with all parties involved. This means proactively informing the buyer, seller, and any relevant third parties, like lenders or title companies, about the nature of the delay, the steps being taken to resolve it, and a revised estimated closing timeline. This approach is correct because it aligns with the Maryland Real Estate Commission's emphasis on honesty, fair dealing, and prompt communication. By fostering transparency, the agent can manage expectations, mitigate frustration, and work collaboratively towards a solution, thereby upholding their fiduciary duty to their clients and adhering to ethical standards of practice. An incorrect approach would be to avoid direct communication with the client about the delay, hoping it resolves itself. This failure to communicate promptly violates ethical obligations and Maryland regulations, requiring licensees to keep clients informed of material facts and significant developments in a transaction. Another incorrect approach is to blame other parties involved without offering concrete solutions or taking responsibility for facilitating the resolution. This not only damages professional relationships, but also fails to address the core issue, potentially leading to further disputes and a breach of the duty of loyalty and care. Finally, offering to compensate the client out of pocket without consulting the brokerage or understanding the full scope of the issue could violate brokerage policies and Maryland's advertising and commission regulations, and it does not address the root cause of the delay. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that prioritizes open and honest communication, proactive problem-solving, and adherence to legal and ethical guidelines. When a dispute or issue arises, the first step should always be to gather all relevant facts, understand the cause of the problem, and then communicate transparently with all affected parties. The focus should be on finding a resolution that is fair to all and compliant with Maryland real estate laws and regulations, rather than assigning blame or avoiding responsibility. Question 2. During the evaluation of property in Maryland, a married couple expresses a strong desire for the property to automatically pass to the surviving spouse upon the death of one of them, without the need for probate for that specific asset. They are seeking advice on the most appropriate form of co-ownership to achieve this objective. Considering Maryland's real property laws, which of the following approaches best addresses their stated goal? Option A. Advise them that joint tenancy is the only option and proceed with that designation without further explanation. Option B. Inform them that the choice of ownership type is not critical, as their wills will ultimately determine how the property is distributed. Option C. Clearly explain the concept of joint tenancy with right of survivorship and how it ensures the property passes directly to the surviving tenant, bypassing probate for that asset, and contrast it with tenancy in common, which allows for individual inheritance. Option D. Suggest that both tenancy in common and joint tenancy with right of survivorship will allow the property to pass to the survivor. The correct answer is C. Clearly explain the concept of joint tenancy with right of survivorship and how it ensures the property passes directly to the surviving tenant, bypassing probate for that asset, and contrast it with tenancy in common, which allows for individual inheritance. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a common but potentially complex situation in Maryland real estate transactions. The challenge lies in accurately identifying and advising on the different forms of co-ownership, as each has distinct legal implications for inheritance, transferability, and liability. Misunderstanding or misrepresenting these ownership types can lead to significant legal disputes, financial losses for clients, and professional repercussions for the licensee. Careful judgment is required to ensure the client fully understands their options and makes an informed decision aligned with their estate planning goals. Correct approach analysis. The best professional practice involves clearly explaining the fundamental differences between tenancy in common and joint tenancy with right of survivorship, specifically in the context of Maryland law. This approach educates the clients on how each form of ownership dictates the distribution of the property upon the death of one owner. Tenancy in common allows for individual inheritance according to a will or intestacy laws, while joint tenancy with right of survivorship automatically passes the deceased owner's share to the surviving joint tenant, bypassing probate for that specific asset. This explanation should highlight that joint tenancy with right of survivorship is the mechanism that achieves the client's stated desire for the property to pass directly to the survivor without probate. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach is to simply state that joint tenancy is the only option without fully explaining the implications of tenancy in common. This fails to provide the clients with a comprehensive understanding of their choices and the potential consequences of each. It also risks misrepresenting the default or most common forms of co-ownership. Another incorrect approach is to suggest that both tenancy in common and joint tenancy with right of survivorship would achieve their goal of the property passing to the survivor. This is factually incorrect regarding tenancy in common, which does not include the right of survivorship. This misstatement could lead the clients to choose an ownership structure that does not meet their specific inheritance objectives. A further incorrect approach is to advise them that the choice of ownership type is irrelevant to their estate planning goals, as their wills will dictate the distribution. While wills are crucial for overall estate distribution, they cannot override the automatic survivorship feature of joint tenancy, with right of survivorship for the specific property held in that manner. This approach demonstrates a fundamental misunderstanding of how property ownership forms interact with estate planning documents. Professional reasoning. Professionals should approach this situation by first actively listening to and understanding the client's explicit goals. Then, they must leverage their knowledge of Maryland property law to explain the available ownership structures and their specific legal ramifications. The decision-making process should involve educating the client, presenting all viable options with their pros and cons, and guiding them towards a choice that aligns with their stated objectives, while always emphasizing that the final decision rests with the client. Question 3. Stakeholder feedback indicates that prospective borrowers in Maryland often express excitement about potential home purchases and inquire about specific loan terms early in the process. A mortgage loan originator in Maryland receives a call from a potential borrower who has just found a home they love and is eager to know what interest rate and monthly payment they can expect. The borrower provides some basic financial information over the phone. What is the most appropriate and compliant response for the mortgage loan originator in Maryland? Option A. Reassure the borrower that based on their enthusiasm and the initial information, everything will work out and they should proceed with their home purchase plans with confidence. Option B. Explain that while a definitive loan approval and specific terms can only be provided after a full loan application is submitted and underwriting review is completed, the originator can provide an estimate of potential loan terms based on current market conditions and the borrower's preliminary information, while clearly outlining the subsequent steps in the application process. Option C. Provide a specific interest rate and monthly payment amount based on the preliminary information, assuring the borrower that this is a very likely scenario for their loan. Option D. Suggest that the borrower can lock in a rate based on this preliminary conversation, as it seems like a strong application. The correct answer is B. Explain that while a definitive loan approval and specific terms can only be provided after a full loan application is submitted an underwriting review is completed, the originator can provide an estimate of potential loan terms based on current market conditions and the borrower's preliminary information, while clearly outlining the subsequent steps in the application process. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires a mortgage loan originator, MLO, in Maryland to navigate the delicate balance between client enthusiasm and regulatory compliance during the initial stages of the mortgage application process. The MLO must avoid making commitments or providing information that could be construed as a guarantee or misrepresentation, which could lead to violations of Maryland's real estate and mortgage lending laws, as well as federal regulations like RESPA and TILA. The pressure to secure a loan and satisfy a client can tempt an MLO to overstep boundaries, making careful judgment and adherence to established procedures paramount. Correct approach analysis. The best professional approach involves clearly explaining to the prospective borrower that while the MLO can provide an estimate of potential loan terms based on current market conditions and the borrower's preliminary information, a definitive loan approval and specific terms can only be provided after a full loan application is submitted and underwriting review is completed. This approach is correct because it aligns with Maryland's regulatory framework for mortgage loan originators, which emphasizes transparency and prohibits misleading statements. By managing expectations and outlining the necessary steps, the MLO avoids making premature commitments, thereby adhering to ethical standards and preventing potential violations of consumer protection laws. This also sets a professional tone, demonstrating a commitment to a thorough and compliant process. Incorrect approaches analysis. Providing a specific interest rate and monthly payment amount without a complete application and underwriting review is a regulatory failure. This action could be interpreted as a guarantee or a commitment to a specific loan product and rate, which is not permissible before the full evaluation process. Such a premature commitment can mislead the borrower and potentially violate Maryland's consumer protection laws regarding deceptive trade practices. Suggesting that the borrower can lock in a rate based on the preliminary conversation, even with a disclaimer, is also problematic. Rate locks are a standard part of the mortgage process. Initiating this discussion and implying a rate is secured without the formal application and underwriting is premature and can create a false sense of security for the borrower. This could lead to issues if the borrower's financial situation changes or if underwriting reveals factors that prevent the loan from closing at the discussed rate, potentially violating disclosure requirements. Focusing solely on the borrower's excitement and assuring them that everything will work out without detailing the necessary steps and potential contingencies is an ethical lapse. While empathy is important, an MLO's primary responsibility is to guide the borrower through a compliant and realistic process. This approach lacks the necessary transparency and can lead to disappointment and potential legal recourse if the loan does not proceed as the borrower might have been led to believe. Professional reasoning. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that prioritizes regulatory compliance and ethical conduct. This involves 1. Understanding and internalizing all applicable Maryland real estate and mortgage lending laws and federal regulations. 2. Adhering strictly to established company policies and procedures for loan origination. 3. Practicing transparent and honest communication. Managing client expectations by clearly outlining the process, required documentation, and potential outcomes without making premature guarantees. 4. Seeking clarification from supervisors or legal counsel when faced with ambiguous situations or client requests that may push regulatory boundaries. Question 4. The performance metrics show a significant increase in buyer inquiries for properties in Anne Arundel County, Maryland. Your client, the seller of a single-family home, has just ratified a purchase agreement with a buyer. Shortly after, the seller expresses significant regret and wishes to withdraw from the sale, stating they have received a better offer from a friend and want to avoid the hassle of the current transaction. As the listing agent, what is the most appropriate course of action to advise your client? Option A. Offer to help the seller find a technicality or loophole within the ratified contract that would allow them to exit the agreement without penalty. Option B. Suggest the seller contact the buyer and attempt to renegotiate the terms of the ratified contract without disclosing their desire to withdraw, hoping to force the buyer into a less favorable agreement. Option C. Explain to the seller the legal implications of breaching the ratified contract, including potential legal action by the buyer and the forfeiture of the earnest money deposit, and advise them to consult with an attorney if they wish to explore further options. Option D. Advise the seller to simply ignore the current contract and proceed with the offer from their friend, assuring them that most buyers do not pursue legal action. The correct answer is C. Explain to the seller the legal implications of breaching the ratified contract, including potential legal action by the buyer and the forfeiture of the earnest money deposit, and advise them to consult with an attorney if they wish to explore further options. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario is professionally challenging because it involves a potential breach of contract due to a seller's change of heart after a valid offer has been accepted. The real estate agent must navigate the seller's emotional decision while upholding their fiduciary duties to both parties and adhering to Maryland real estate contract law. Missteps could lead to legal action, loss of commission, and damage to the agent's reputation. Careful judgment is required to balance the seller's wishes with their contractual obligations. Correct approach analysis. The best approach involves clearly explaining to the seller their legal obligations under the ratified contract. This includes detailing the consequences of breaching the contract, such as potential legal action for specific performance or damages, and the forfeiture of the earnest money deposit. The agent must also explain that the buyer has a legal right to enforce the contract. This approach is correct because it prioritizes adherence to Maryland contract law and the agent's duty to advise the client truthfully and competently about the legal ramifications of their actions. It upholds the integrity of the transaction and protects the agent from liability by ensuring the seller is fully informed of their contractual commitments. Incorrect approach is analysis. Advising the seller to simply ignore the contract and hope the buyer doesn't pursue legal action is a failure to uphold the agent's duty of competence and honesty. It exposes both the seller and the agent to significant legal risk and violates ethical standards by not providing accurate legal advice. Suggesting the seller try to renegotiate terms without the buyer's consent or knowledge is deceptive and undermines the binding nature of the accepted offer, potentially leading to claims of bad faith. Offering to find a loophole in the contract without proper legal consultation is unprofessional and could constitute the unauthorized practice of law, as agents are not licensed to provide legal interpretations or advice. Professional reasoning. Professionals should always prioritize legal compliance and ethical conduct. When faced with a client's desire to withdraw from a ratified contract, the first step is to thoroughly review the contract terms and relevant Maryland law. The agent's role is to advise on the contractual obligations and potential consequences, not to circumvent them. If legal interpretation is required beyond the scope of standard contract understanding, the agent should strongly recommend the client seek independent legal counsel from a qualified attorney. Maintaining clear, honest communication and documenting all advice given is crucial. Question 5. The performance metrics show a consistent trend of tenant dissatisfaction with the terms of standard lease agreements used by your brokerage in Maryland. As a licensed real estate salesperson, you are representing a landlord who wishes to lease out a property in Baltimore. The landlord provides you with a lease agreement template they have used for years, which you notice contains clauses that may not fully align with current Maryland landlord-tenant regulations regarding notice periods for entry and security deposit handling. What is the most professional and legally compliant course of action? Option A. Proceed with using the landlord's existing lease agreement template, assuming it has been acceptable in the past, and present it to prospective tenants without significant discussion of its specific clauses. Option B. Recommend that the tenant's attorney review the lease agreement, placing the burden of ensuring compliance entirely on the tenant's legal representative. Option C. Advise the landlord that the lease agreement should be reviewed by a qualified attorney to ensure compliance with all current Maryland laws and regulations, and recommend using a lease agreement that has been vetted for Maryland compliance, while also explaining the key terms and their implications to both the landlord and prospective tenants. Option D. Inform the landlord that you cannot assist them with this property, unless they agree to use a generic lease agreement found online that you believe is sufficient, without seeking legal counsel for specific Maryland compliance. Correct answer is C. Advise the landlord that the lease agreement should be reviewed by a qualified attorney to ensure compliance with all current Maryland laws and regulations, and recommend using a lease agreement that has been vetted for Maryland compliance, while also explaining the key terms and their implications to both the landlord and prospective tenants. Explanation: the performance metrics show a consistent trend of tenant dissatisfaction with the terms of standard lease agreements used by your brokerage in Maryland. This scenario is professionally challenging because it directly impacts client satisfaction, potential legal disputes, and the brokerage reputation. Navigating lease agreements requires a thorough understanding of Maryland's landlord-tenant laws to ensure fairness and compliance. Careful judgment is required to balance the interests of landlords and tenants while adhering to legal mandates. The best approach involves proactively educating clients about the implications of different lease clauses and recommending the use of legally sound, clearly written lease agreements that comply with Maryland law. This includes advising landlords on their obligations and tenants on their rights, ensuring both parties understand the terms before signing. This approach is correct because it prioritizes informed consent and legal compliance, which are fundamental ethical and regulatory requirements for real estate professionals in Maryland. By facilitating clear communication and ensuring the use of appropriate lease documents, you mitigate risks for all parties and uphold professional standards. An approach that involves simply presenting a landlord with a pre-filled lease agreement without discussing the specific terms or their implications for the tenant is professionally unacceptable. This fails to uphold the duty of care owed to both parties and could lead to misunderstandings or violations of Maryland's landlord-tenant laws, such as those concerning security deposits or the landlord's duty to maintain the property. Another unacceptable approach is to advise a tenant to sign a lease agreement without fully explaining its clauses, especially those that might be disadvantageous or unclear. This neglects the licensee's responsibility to ensure clients understand the commitments they are making and could expose the tenant to unfair terms or legal challenges. Finally, relying solely on generic lease templates without verifying their compliance with current Maryland statutes is also a failure. Real estate laws are subject to change, and using outdated or non-compliant documents can lead to legal repercussions for the landlord, tenant, and the brokerage. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with identifying the core legal and ethical obligations related to lease agreements in Maryland. This involves staying current with relevant statutes, understanding the rights and responsibilities of both landlords and tenants, and prioritizing clear, transparent communication. When advising clients, licensees should always aim to facilitate an informed agreement, ensuring that all parties comprehend the terms and conditions before execution. Question 6. The risk matrix shows a moderate probability of underground storage tank leakage impacting the soil on a property listed for sale in Montgomery County, Maryland, based on the property's age and historical records. The seller is aware of the tank, but believes it is likely not leaking. As the listing agent, what is the most prudent course of action to ensure compliance with Maryland's disclosure requirements and protect your client? Option A. Advise the seller to obtain a professional environmental assessment of the property to determine the extent of any contamination and inform disclosure. Option B. Advise the seller to simply hope for the best and not disclose the potential contamination, as the tank might not be leaking. Option C. Advise the salesperson to downplay the visible signs of potential contamination to prospective buyers without any professional assessment. Option D. Recommend that the seller only disclose the issue if directly asked by a buyer. The correct answer is A. Advise the seller to obtain a professional environmental assessment of the property to determine the extent of any contamination and inform disclosure. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires the real estate salesperson to balance their fiduciary duty to their client with the legal and ethical obligations concerning environmental disclosures in Maryland. The salesperson must navigate potential liability for non-disclosure while also ensuring their client's interests are protected. A failure to properly address the environmental concern could lead to significant legal repercussions for both the client and the agent, as well as damage to the agent's reputation. Correct approach analysis. The best professional approach involves immediately advising the seller to obtain a professional environmental assessment of the property. This is correct because Maryland law, specifically through the Maryland Real Estate Commission, MREC, regulations and common law principles of disclosure, mandates that sellers and their agents disclose no material defects, including environmental hazards. Obtaining a professional assessment is the most proactive and legally sound way to identify the extent of the contamination, understand its implications, and determine the appropriate disclosure strategy. This approach fulfills the agent's duty of care and disclosure obligations by gathering factual information before making representations to potential buyers. It allows for informed decisions regarding remediation, pricing, and disclosure to buyers, thereby mitigating risk for all parties. Incorrect approaches analysis, advising the seller to simply hope for the best and not disclose the potential contamination is a significant ethical and legal failure. This approach directly violates the duty to disclose known material defects under Maryland law and MREC regulations. It exposes the seller to potential lawsuits from the buyer for fraud or misrepresentation and could lead to disciplinary action against the salesperson by the MREC, including license suspension or revocation. Suggesting the salesperson downplay the visible signs of potential contamination to prospective buyers without any professional assessment is also a serious ethical breach. This constitutes active misrepresentation or a failure to disclose a known material fact, which is prohibited by Maryland real estate law. The salesperson's duty is to facilitate an informed transaction, not to obscure potential problems, recommending that the seller only disclose the issue if directly asked by a buyer is insufficient and legally risky. While direct questions can trigger disclosure obligations, the duty to disclose known material defects is broader and proactive. Maryland law expects agents to bring material defects to the attention of buyers, even if not specifically asked, especially when there are visible indicators of a problem. Relying solely on buyer inquiries can still result in liability for non-disclosure if the defect was known or should have been known. Professional reasoning. Professionals in Maryland real estate must adopt a proactive and transparent approach to environmental disclosures. When faced with potential environmental concerns, the decision-making process should prioritize 1. Identifying known or suspected material defects. 2. Consulting relevant Maryland real estate laws and MREC regulations regarding disclosure obligations. 3. Recommending and facilitating professional assessments to gather objective data. 4. Disclosing all known material facts, including the results of any assessments, to potential buyers in writing. 5. Advising the seller on remediation options and their legal implications. This systematic approach ensures compliance, protects all parties, and upholds professional integrity. Question 7. System analysis indicates a potential homebuyer in Maryland is pre-approved for a mortgage, but expresses concern about their ability to make a 20% down payment. They ask you, a licensed Maryland real estate salesperson, how this will affect their loan, and if private mortgage insurance (PMI) can be avoided. What is the most appropriate and legally compliant course of action? Option A. Offer to personally guarantee that the loan will be approved without PMI, as you have a good relationship with several lenders. Option B. Explain that PMI is typically required by lenders for down payments less than 20%, and advise the client to consult with a mortgage lender or broker to discuss their specific financial situation and loan options. Option C. Advise the client to simply try to get the loan approved as is, assuring them that PMI is just a formality and will likely be waived later. Option D. Suggest that the client should not disclose the exact down payment amount to the lender to avoid triggering PMI requirements. The correct answer is B. Explain that PMI is typically required by lenders for down payments less than 20%, and advise the client to consult with a mortgage lender or broker to discuss their specific financial situation and loan options. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires a salesperson to navigate a situation where a client's financial circumstances may impact their ability to secure a mortgage, and the salesperson must provide accurate and ethical guidance without overstepping their professional boundaries or providing financial advice they are not licensed to give. The salesperson must balance the client's needs with regulatory requirements and their own scope of practice. Correct approach analysis. The best professional approach involves clearly explaining to the client that private mortgage insurance, PMI, is typically required by lenders when a down payment is less than 20% of the purchase price. The salesperson should then advise the client to consult with a qualified mortgage lender or broker. This approach is correct because it educates the client on a relevant aspect of mortgage financing without offering specific financial advice or making guarantees. It directs the client to the appropriate professionals who can assess their financial situation and explain the implications of PMI and other loan requirements. This aligns with Maryland real estate licensing laws, which prohibit unlicensed individuals from providing financial advice or acting as mortgage brokers. Incorrect approaches analysis, recommending that the client simply try to get the loan anyway, and that PMI is just a formality, is professionally unacceptable. This approach fails to acknowledge the significant financial implications of PMI for the borrower, potentially leading to unexpected costs and a misunderstanding of loan terms. It also borders on providing assurance about loan approval, which is outside the salesperson's purview and could be construed as misleading. Advising the client to hide the low down payment from the lender is unethical and illegal. This constitutes misrepresentation and could lead to loan denial, foreclosure, and severe legal and professional repercussions for both the client and the salesperson. It directly violates Maryland's real estate regulations regarding honesty and fair dealing, suggesting that the salesperson can personally guarantee the loan will be approved without PMI, is also professionally unacceptable and illegal. A real estate salesperson is not a lender and cannot guarantee loan approval or waive lender requirements like PMI. This is a misrepresentation of their authority and expertise, potentially leading to significant financial harm to the client and severe disciplinary action against the salesperson. Professional reasoning. Professionals should approach such situations by first identifying the client's core concern, securing a mortgage with a lower down payment. They should then recall their scope of practice and regulatory obligations. The decision-making process involves 1. Educating the client on general concepts relevant to their inquiry, like PMI. 2. Identifying the limitations of their own expertise and licensing. 3. Directing the client to licensed and qualified professionals, mortgage lenders/brokers, who can provide specific advice and services. 4. Maintaining honesty, transparency, and ethical conduct throughout the interaction. Question 8. The risk matrix shows a potential buyer in Maryland has offered to purchase a seller's property using a seller financing arrangement. The buyer has proposed a relatively low down payment and a longer amortization period than typically seen in conventional loans. The seller, eager to sell quickly, is considering the offer. As a licensed real estate salesperson in Maryland, what is the most responsible course of action to ensure the seller's best interests are protected? Option A. Draft the seller financing agreement immediately to secure the deal as the buyer is eager to move forward. Option B. Downplay the risks associated with seller financing and focus on the advantages of a quicker closing, assuring the seller that this is a common practice. Option C. Fully explain the potential risks and benefits of seller financing to the seller, including the possibility of default, tax implications, and strongly advise them to consult with an independent attorney and financial advisor before proceeding. Option D. Advise the seller that seller financing is generally a safe option and that their primary concern should be accepting the highest offer. The correct answer is C. Fully explain the potential risks and benefits of seller financing to the seller, including the possibility of default, tax implications, and strongly advise them to consult with an independent attorney and financial advisor before proceeding. Explanation. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires a real estate salesperson in Maryland to navigate a complex financing situation while upholding their fiduciary duties to the client and adhering to Maryland's real estate licensing laws and regulations. The salesperson must balance the client's immediate desire for a quick sale with the long-term financial implications and potential risks associated with the proposed financing structure. Careful judgment is required to ensure the client makes an informed decision that is in their best interest, rather than simply facilitating a transaction that might benefit the salesperson or the buyer more immediately. The best approach involves thoroughly educating the seller on the risks and benefits of the proposed seller financing, including the potential for default, the implications for their tax situation, and the importance of legal counsel. This approach is correct because Maryland law, specifically through the Maryland Real Estate Commission's regulations and the general principles of agency law, mandates that licensees act in the best interest of their clients. This includes providing full disclosure of material facts and advising clients on matters that could affect their financial well-being. Encouraging the seller to seek independent legal and financial advice is crucial, as a real estate salesperson is not qualified to provide such specialized counsel. This ensures the seller understands the full scope of the agreement and its potential consequences, fulfilling the salesperson's duty of care and loyalty. An incorrect approach would be to downplay the risks of seller financing and emphasize only the potential for a faster closing. This fails to meet the salesperson's fiduciary duty to disclose all material facts and risks to the seller. Maryland regulations require licensees to be honest and truthful in all dealings and to avoid misrepresentation or concealment of material facts. Another incorrect approach would be to proceed with drafting the seller financing agreement without advising the seller to consult with an attorney. This constitutes the unauthorized practice of law, which is strictly prohibited for real estate licensees in Maryland. Licensees are expected to facilitate transactions within their scope of expertise and to refer clients to qualified professionals for legal and financial advice when necessary. Finally, an incorrect approach would be to pressure the seller into accepting the offer by highlighting only the positive aspects of the buyer's proposal and ignoring the potential downsides. This violates the duty of loyalty and good faith owed to the client and could be construed as a misrepresentation or omission of material facts, leading to disciplinary action by the Maryland Real Estate Commission. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that prioritizes client education and informed consent. This involves identifying potential risks and benefits, clearly communicating these to the client, recommending consultation with independent legal and financial professionals, and ensuring all disclosures are made in writing. The salesperson's role is to facilitate the transaction while safeguarding the client's interests, not to push for a deal at the expense of the client's understanding or financial security. Question 9. The risk matrix shows that a buyer client in Maryland is interested in purchasing a property for $310,000. The property has been appraised for $300,000. The buyer intends to make a down payment of $15,000 and is seeking an FHA loan for their primary residence. What is the maximum FHA loan amount the buyer can obtain for this property, assuming they meet all other FHA eligibility criteria? Option A, $289,500. Option B, $300,000. Option C, $295,000. Option D, $290,000. Correct answer is A, $289,500. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires a Maryland real estate salesperson to accurately calculate the maximum loan amount for a potential buyer using an FHA loan, while also considering the buyer's specific financial situation and the property's appraised value. Miscalculations can lead to misrepresentation of loan eligibility, potentially causing financial harm to the buyer and violating Maryland real estate licensing laws and FHA guidelines. The salesperson must demonstrate a thorough understanding of FHA loan-to-value, LTV, ratios and borrower qualification criteria. Correct approach analysis. The best professional practice involves first determining the FHA's maximum allowable loan amount based on the property's appraised value or sales price, whichever is lower, and the applicable FHA LTV limits. For primary residents with less than 10% down payment, the FHA typically allows a maximum LTV of 96.5%. Therefore, the maximum FHA loan amount is calculated as the lower of the appraised value or sales price multiplied by the maximum LTV. In this case, the lower of $300,000 appraised value or $310,000 sales price is $300,000. The maximum FHA loan would be $0,965 times $300,000 equals $289,500. This approach is correct because it adheres strictly to FHA regulations for determining the maximum loan amount, ensuring the buyer is not misled about their borrowing capacity. It also aligns with Maryland's requirement for licensees to provide accurate and truthful information to clients. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach would be to simply calculate the loan amount based on the sales price without considering the appraised value. This fails to acknowledge that FHA loans are based on the lesser of the sales price or the appraised value, leading to an inflated potential loan amount and misrepresentation. Another incorrect approach would be to calculate the loan amount based on the buyer's stated down payment of $15,000 without first establishing the maximum loanable amount based on the property's value and FHA LTV limits. This overlooks the fundamental constraint imposed by the FHA's valuation and LTV requirements, potentially suggesting a loan amount that the property or FHA guidelines would not support. A further incorrect approach would be to assume the buyer can borrow the full sales price minus their down payment, ignoring the FHA's specific LTV requirements. This would result in a loan amount of $295,000, $310,000, $15,000, which exceeds the maximum allowable FHA loan based on the appraised value and the 96.5% LTV. This approach violates FHA regulations and misleads the buyer about their financing options. Professional reasoning. Professionals should always prioritize accuracy and adherence to regulatory guidelines when advising clients on financing. The decision-making process should involve 1. Identifying the relevant loan program, FHA in this case, and its specific requirements. 2. Determining the controlling valuation, appraised value or sales price, whichever is lower. 3. Applying the program's LTV ratio to the controlling valuation to establish the maximum loan amount. 4. Verifying the buyer's down payment is sufficient for the calculated loan amount. 5. Communicating findings clearly and accurately to the client, managing expectations based on factual data and regulatory constraints. Question 10. Process analysis reveals that a Maryland real estate salesperson is assisting a first-time homebuyer who is exploring financing options. The buyer is confused by the terms fixed rate, adjustable rate, and interest-only mortgages and asks the salesperson for guidance on which type would be best for them. What is the most appropriate and legally compliant course of action for the salesperson in Maryland? Option A. Provide a detailed analysis of projected interest rate fluctuations over the next 10 years and advise the buyer to choose the mortgage type that aligns with these projections. Option B. Recommend an adjustable rate mortgage, explaining that it will likely offer lower initial payments, which the salesperson believes will be most beneficial for the buyer's current financial situation. Option C. Explain the fundamental characteristics of fixed rate, adjustable rate, and interest-only mortgages, including how payments are structured and the general implications of each, while strongly advising the buyer to consult with a licensed mortgage lender or financial advisor for personalized recommendations. Option D. Avoid discussing the different mortgage types altogether, stating that it is outside the salesperson's area of expertise and that the buyer should figure it out on their own. The correct answer is C. Explain the fundamental characteristics of fixed rate, adjustable rate, and interest-only mortgages, including how payments are structured and the general implications of each, while strongly advising the buyer to consult with a licensed mortgage lender or financial advisor for personalized recommendations. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge because a real estate salesperson must guide a client through complex mortgage options without providing unlicensed financial advice. The salesperson's role is to facilitate the transaction and ensure the client understands the implications of different mortgage types as they relate to property ownership and affordability. But they must avoid crossing the line into recommending specific financial products or strategies. Careful judgment is required to balance helpfulness with regulatory compliance. Correct approach analysis. The best professional practice involves educating the client about the fundamental characteristics of each mortgage type, enabling them to make an informed decision in consultation with a qualified mortgage lender or financial advisor. This approach focuses on providing factual information about how fixed rate, adjustable rate, and interest-only mortgages function, their typical pros and cons in terms of payment stability and long-term cost, and the importance of seeking expert financial guidance. This aligns with Maryland real estate licensing regulations that permit licensees to provide general information about real estate transactions, but prohibit them from engaging in activities that require separate licensing, such as financial advising or mortgage brokering. The salesperson acts as an informed facilitator, empowering the client to seek specialized advice. Incorrect approach is analysis. One incorrect approach is to strongly recommend a specific mortgage type, such as an adjustable rate mortgage, based on the salesperson's perception of the client's financial situation or market trends. This constitutes providing unlicensed financial advice, which is a violation of Maryland real estate law and potentially securities regulations. It oversteps the salesperson's authority and exposes both the client and the salesperson to significant risk. Another incorrect approach is to downplay the differences between mortgage types or to avoid discussing them altogether, citing a lack of expertise. While a salesperson is not a mortgage expert, ignoring or minimizing the discussion of fundamental mortgage structures can be seen as a failure to act in the client's best interest. Maryland law requires licensees to be honest and truthful and to exercise reasonable care and diligence. A complete avoidance of the topic, when it is central to the client's ability to purchase the property, could be interpreted as a lack of diligence. A third incorrect approach is to provide detailed projections of future interest rate changes or to guarantee specific payment amounts for adjustable rate or interest-only mortgages. This is speculative and constitutes providing financial advice, which is outside the scope of a Maryland real estate salesperson's license. Such actions can lead to misrepresentations and potential legal liability. Professional reasoning. Professionals should adopt a decision-making framework that prioritizes client education and regulatory compliance. This involves understanding the boundaries of their license, identifying when to refer clients to other licensed professionals, like mortgage lenders or financial advisors, and focusing on providing clear, factual information about the real estate transaction itself. When discussing mortgage options, the focus should be on explaining the mechanics of each type and the general implications, rather than offering personalized recommendations or predictions. Question 11. The evaluation methodology shows a historic property in Baltimore, Maryland, with limited recent sales of similar homes and a unique architectural design. The licensee is tasked with providing a comprehensive opinion of value, which approach best reflects a thorough and ethically sound valuation process in this specific Maryland context. Option A. Prioritizing the income approach, using projected rental income from similar properties in the area. Option B. Relying solely on a comparative market analysis, making significant adjustments for the property's unique features and age. Option C. Focusing exclusively on the cost approach, estimating the replacement cost new less depreciation for the historic structure. Option D. Reconciling the results from a comparative market analysis, cost approach, and income approach, giving appropriate weight to each based on the property's characteristics and market data. The correct answer is D. Reconciling the results from a comparative market analysis, cost approach, and income approach, giving appropriate weight to each based on the property's characteristics and market data. Explanation. This scenario is professionally challenging because a real estate licensee in Maryland must select the most appropriate valuation method for a unique property, balancing the client's needs with regulatory compliance and ethical practice. The property's age and specialized nature mean that standard approaches may require significant adjustments or may not be fully applicable, demanding careful judgment. The most appropriate approach involves a comprehensive analysis that integrates multiple valuation methods, prioritizing those best suited to the property's characteristics and market conditions. This hybrid approach, often referred to as a reconciliation of values, allows the licensee to leverage the strengths of each method while mitigating their weaknesses. For historic property with limited comparable sales and unique construction, the comparative market analysis provides a baseline by identifying similar recently sold properties, even if adjustments are substantial. The cost approach is particularly relevant for unique or new construction, where replacement cost is a strong indicator of value. And for older properties, it can establish a value for the land and the depreciated value of the improvements. The income approach is crucial if the property is or could be used for income generation, reflecting its investment potential. Maryland real estate regulations and professional standards emphasize providing clients with accurate and well-supported opinions of value. By reconciling the results from these methods, the licensee can arrive at a more defensible and comprehensive valuation, fulfilling their fiduciary duty to the client and adhering to the principles of professional practice. Using only the comparative market analysis would be insufficient if truly comparable properties are scarce or require extensive, subjective adjustments, potentially leading to an inaccurate valuation. Relying solely on the cost approach might not adequately reflect market demand or the property's income-generating potential, especially for older structures where depreciation is difficult to accurately quantify. Focusing exclusively on the income approach would be inappropriate if the property is not primarily an investment vehicle or if rental data is unreliable, failing to capture the property's intrinsic value beyond its income-producing capacity. Each of these singular approaches, when applied without considering the property's specific attributes and market context, risks misrepresenting the property's true market value, potentially violating ethical obligations to provide competent and diligent service. Professionals should approach property valuation by first understanding the property's type, intended use, and market dynamics. They should then consider which valuation methods are most applicable and reliable given the available data and the property's unique characteristics. A thorough analysis involves applying multiple methods where appropriate, critically evaluating the strengths and weaknesses of each, and then reconciling the results to form a well-supported opinion of value. This process ensures that the valuation is comprehensive, defensible, and serves the client's best interests while adhering to professional standards. Question 12. Process analysis reveals that a buyer client in Maryland is expressing significant uncertainty about the various mortgage financing options available to them, including different interest rate structures and loan terms. What is the most appropriate and professionally responsible course of action for the Maryland real estate salesperson to take? Option A. Recommend a specific mortgage lender based on the salesperson's personal experience or perceived competitive rates. Option B. Offer to assist the buyer in completing mortgage application forms and explain the implications of different loan terms. Option C. Suggest that the buyer research mortgage options independently through online resources and make their own decision. Option D. Advise the buyer to consult with a licensed mortgage lender or broker to discuss their specific financial situation and explore suitable loan products. The correct answer is D. Advise the buyer to consult with a licensed mortgage lender or broker to discuss their specific financial situation and explore suitable loan products. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires a real estate salesperson in Maryland to navigate the complexities of financing options for a buyer while adhering to strict disclosure requirements and avoiding the unauthorized practice of law or financial advice. The salesperson must balance assisting the client with understanding their options without overstepping professional boundaries or providing advice that could lead to financial harm or legal repercussions. Careful judgment is required to ensure the client receives accurate, relevant information without the salesperson acting as a financial advisor or legal counsel. Correct approach analysis. The best professional practice involves guiding the buyer to consult with qualified professionals who can provide tailored financial advice. This approach directly addresses the buyer's need for expert guidance on mortgage options by recommending they speak with a licensed mortgage lender or broker. This aligns with Maryland real estate licensing laws and ethical standards, which prohibit real estate licensees from providing financial or legal advice outside their scope of expertise. By facilitating the connection to a qualified professional, the salesperson acts as a facilitator, ensuring the buyer receives accurate and appropriate advice, thereby protecting both the buyer and the licensee from potential liabilities. Incorrect approach is analysis. Recommending a specific lender based on personal preference or perceived best rates without a thorough understanding of the buyer's complete financial picture and the lender's specific offerings constitutes providing financial advice, which is outside the scope of a Maryland real estate salesperson's license. This could lead to the buyer choosing a loan product that is not in their best interest, suggesting that the buyer can simply figure it out by looking at online resources is insufficient and fails to provide the necessary guidance and support a client expects, potentially leaving them overwhelmed and misinformed. Offering to help them fill out the loan application crosses the line into providing assistance that could be construed as financial advice or even the unauthorized practice of law, as loan applications involve complex legal and financial terms. Professional reasoning. Professionals should always prioritize client well-being and operate within the bounds of their license and expertise. When a client's needs extend beyond a salesperson's qualifications, the ethical and professional approach is to refer them to a qualified expert. This involves understanding the client's situation, identifying the need for specialized advice, and making appropriate referrals to licensed professionals such as mortgage lenders, financial advisors, or attorneys. This process ensures the client receives the best possible service while mitigating risks for the salesperson and maintaining professional integrity. Question 13. Process analysis reveals that a Maryland real estate brokerage needs to optimize its financial management practices. Which of the following approaches best ensures compliance with Maryland Real Estate Commission regulation regarding budgeting, reporting, and record keeping? Option A. Assign all financial record-keeping responsibilities to individual salespersons without a centralized oversight or review process by the broker of record. Option B. Maintain financial records using a collection of scattered receipts and informal notes, with the expectation that individual salespersons will provide summaries when requested. Option C. Record transactions only when significant financial events occur, and forego regular financial reporting unless specifically requested by the Commission. Option D. Implement a standardized accounting system to meticulously record all financial transactions. Generate regular financial reports, and have these reports reviewed by the broker of record. Correct answer is D. Implement a standardized accounting system to meticulously record all financial transactions, generate regular financial reports, and have these reports reviewed by the broker of record. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a common challenge in real estate brokerage operations in Maryland: maintaining accurate and accessible financial records while ensuring compliance with state regulations and ethical obligations. The brokerage must balance the need for efficient record keeping with the legal requirements for transparency and auditability. Failure to do so can lead to disciplinary action, fines, and damage to the brokerage reputation. The challenge lies in selecting a system that is both practical for daily operations and robust enough to meet regulatory demands. Correct approach analysis. The best approach involves establishing a standardized, systematic process for recording all financial transactions, including earnest money deposits, commissions, and operating expenses, in a dedicated accounting system. This system should be designed to generate regular financial reports that are reviewed by a designated responsible party, such as the broker of record. This method ensures that all financial activities are documented, categorized, and readily available for review, audit, or reporting purposes, directly aligning with the Maryland Real Estate Commission's requirements for maintaining accurate books and records. This systematic approach facilitates compliance with record-keeping mandates and supports sound financial management. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach is to rely on ad hoc record-keeping methods, such as scattered receipts and informal notes, for tracking financial transactions. This lack of standardization makes it extremely difficult to generate accurate financial reports, verify the flow of funds, or respond to audit requests, thereby violating Maryland's stringent record-keeping regulations. Another unacceptable approach is to delegate all financial record-keeping to individual salespersons without a centralized oversight mechanism. This can lead to inconsistencies, incomplete records, and a lack of accountability, as the broker of record is ultimately responsible for the brokerage's financial compliance. Finally, neglecting to generate and review regular financial reports, even if individual transactions are recorded, means that potential discrepancies or compliance issues may go unnoticed until a formal audit or complaint arises, which is a failure to proactively manage the brokerage's financial health and regulatory adherence. Professional reasoning. Professionals should adopt a proactive and systematic approach to financial management. This involves understanding the specific record-keeping requirements mandated by the Maryland Real Estate Commission, implementing a robust accounting system, and establishing clear internal controls and reporting procedures. Regular review of financial reports by the broker of record is crucial for identifying and rectifying any issues promptly, ensuring both operational efficiency and regulatory compliance. Question 14. Analysis of a landlord-client's request to initiate an eviction in Maryland due to non-payment of rent. A real estate salesperson must ensure the landlord understands the legally mandated steps. The landlord is frustrated by the delay and asks for the quickest way to remove the tenant, suggesting they could simply change the locks or tell the tenant to leave immediately. What is the most appropriate course of action for the real estate salesperson? Option A. Recommend the landlord immediately file an eviction lawsuit with the court, as the tenant has not paid rent and is in breach of the lease. Option B. Suggest the landlord change the locks to prevent the tenant from entering the property until rent is paid. Option C. Advise the landlord to verbally inform the tenant that they have 3 days to vacate the premises due to non-payment. Option D. Advise the landlord that the first and mandatory step is to serve a formal written notice to quit, complying with all requirements of Maryland law, before any further legal action can be taken. The correct answer is D. Advise the landlord that the first and mandatory step is to serve a formal written notice to quit, complying with all requirements of Maryland law, before any further legal action can be taken. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires a real estate licensee to navigate a sensitive legal process while upholding their fiduciary duties to their client, the landlord. The licensee must balance the landlord's desire for a swift resolution with the tenant's legal rights and the strict procedural requirements of Maryland eviction law. Failure to adhere to these procedures can lead to significant legal repercussions for the landlord, including dismissal of the eviction, potential financial penalties, and damage to the licensee's reputation and license. Careful judgment is required to ensure all actions are legally compliant and ethically sound. Correct approach analysis. The best professional approach involves advising the landlord to strictly follow the legal eviction process as outlined by Maryland law, which begins with proper notice. This means ensuring the landlord understands that a formal written notice to quit, served correctly according to Maryland statutes, e.g., Maryland Code, Real Property Article, Section 8-402. 1. Is the mandatory first step before filing any court action. The licensee should explain that attempting to circumvent this notice period or using informal methods can invalidate the eviction attempt. This approach is correct because it prioritizes legal compliance, protects the landlord from potential legal challenges, and upholds the licensee's duty to provide accurate legal information within the scope of their license. Incorrect approach is analysis. Advising the landlord to immediately file a lawsuit without first providing a legally sufficient written notice to quit is a significant regulatory failure. Maryland law mandates specific notice requirements before a landlord can initiate a summary ejectment action. Failing to provide this notice means the court will likely dismiss the case, forcing the landlord to start the process over, incurring further costs and delays. Suggesting the landlord change the locks or remove the tenant's belongings without a court order is illegal self-help eviction, which is strictly prohibited in Maryland and carries severe penalties for the landlord and potentially the licensee. This action violates the tenant's fundamental rights and exposes all parties to civil and criminal liability. Telling the landlord to verbally inform the tenant they must leave within a few days, without any written documentation or adherence to statutory notice periods, is also a failure to comply with Maryland's legal requirements for terminating a tenancy. Verbal notices are generally insufficient and unenforceable for evictions in Maryland. Professional reasoning. Professionals should always prioritize legal compliance and ethical conduct. When faced with a situation involving legal processes like eviction, the decision-making framework should involve 1. Identifying the governing laws and regulations, in this case, Maryland landlord, tenant, and eviction statutes. 2. Understanding the specific procedural steps required by those laws. 3. Advising the client to strictly adhere to these procedures, emphasizing the legal consequences of non-compliance. 4. Recognizing the limitations of a real estate licensee's authority and recommending consultation with legal counsel for complex legal matters or when there is uncertainty about legal requirements. Question 15. The review process indicates that a prospective buyer in Maryland has expressed strong interest in purchasing a property and has asked you to show them several listings. However, when you mention the need for a buyer representation agreement, they express reluctance, stating they want to test the waters and are not ready to commit to a formal contract. What is the most appropriate course of action for a licensed Maryland real estate salesperson in this situation? Option A. Insist on the buyer signing a comprehensive, exclusive buyer representation agreement immediately before showing any properties, regardless of their reservations. Option B. Proceed with showing properties and providing services without a written agreement, relying on the buyer's verbal commitment to work with you. Option C. Agree to show properties without a formal agreement and offer to work on a commission-only basis if a sale occurs, to incentivize the buyer to proceed. Option D. Explain the benefits and necessity of a buyer representation agreement, outlining its terms and protections, and offer to discuss a mutually agreeable duration and scope of services. The correct answer is D. Explain the benefits and necessity of a buyer representation agreement, outlining its terms and protections, and offer to discuss a mutually agreeable duration and scope of services. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a common challenge in real estate brokerage where a potential buyer expresses interest but is hesitant to commit to a formal buyer representation agreement. The challenge lies in balancing the agent's need for a clear contractual commitment to protect their time and effort with the buyer's desire for flexibility and a trial period. Navigating this requires a thorough understanding of Maryland's real estate laws and ethical obligations to ensure both parties are protected and informed. Correct approach analysis. The best approach involves clearly explaining the benefits and necessity of a buyer representation agreement under Maryland law, emphasizing that it defines the scope of services, fiduciary duties, and compensation. This includes outlining the duration, termination clauses, and the agent's exclusive commitment to the buyer. By presenting this as a standard and essential part of professional representation, the agent educates the buyer on the protections and clarity the agreement provides, aligning with Maryland Real Estate Commission regulations that promote transparency and informed consent in agency relationships. Incorrect approach is analysis. One incorrect approach is to proceed with showing properties without any written agreement, relying solely on verbal assurances. This violates Maryland's requirement for written agency agreements to define the terms of representation and compensation, leaving both parties vulnerable to misunderstandings and potential disputes. It also fails to establish the fiduciary duties owed by the agent to the buyer. Another incorrect approach is to pressure the buyer into signing a lengthy, exclusive agreement immediately, without adequately explaining its terms or offering a less restrictive alternative for an initial period. This can be perceived as coercive and may not align with the buyer's comfort level, potentially leading to a breach of trust and failing to uphold the ethical obligation to act in the client's best interest by ensuring they fully understand what they are signing. A third incorrect approach is to offer to waive commission or significantly reduce it in exchange for the buyer not signing a formal agreement. This circumvents the established compensation structures and can create an appearance of impropriety, potentially violating brokerage policies and Maryland regulations regarding fair compensation and transparent dealings. It also fails to establish a clear agency relationship and the associated duties. Professional reasoning. Professionals should always prioritize establishing a clear, written agency relationship at the outset of representation. This involves educating the client about the purpose and benefits of the agreement, ensuring they understand their rights and obligations, and that the agent's duties are clearly defined. When a client is hesitant, the professional should explore options for a limited-term or non-exclusive agreement that still provides a framework for representation while addressing the client's concerns, always ensuring full disclosure and informed consent in compliance with Maryland law. Question 16. Performance analysis shows that a Maryland-licensed real estate salesperson has a listing agreement with a seller. During the listing period, the salesperson discusses with the seller how the commission will be handled if another brokerage brings the buyer. The salesperson also mentions to the seller that they are considering donating a portion of their commission to a local animal shelter after the sale closes, but this is not documented in the listing agreement. Later, the salesperson suggests to a potential buyer that if they purchase the listed property and also use the salesperson to buy another home, the salesperson might be able to adjust their commission. Which of the following approaches best reflects Maryland's regulatory framework for commission structures and fee arrangements? Option A. The salesperson should have documented all commission splits with cooperating brokerages and any potential charitable contributions in writing, ideally within the listing agreement or a signed addendum, and obtain the seller's explicit consent before proceeding with any services or accepting any offers. Option B. The salesperson acted appropriately by verbally discussing potential commission splits and charitable donations with the seller, as these are internal arrangements that do not require formal documentation until after the transaction is complete. Option C. The salesperson should have focused solely on the commission from the current listing and avoided any discussion of future transactions or charitable donations, as these are separate matters that can be addressed independently of the listing agreement. Option D. The salesperson's suggestion to the buyer about adjusting commission for a future purchase is acceptable as long as the buyer agrees, as it is a separate potential transaction and not directly related to the current listing agreement's commission. The correct answer is A. The salesperson should have documented all commission splits with cooperating brokerages and any potential charitable contributions in writing, ideally within the listing agreement or a signed addendum, and obtain the seller's explicit consent before proceeding with any services or accepting any offers. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it involves navigating a potential conflict of interest and ensuring transparency in commission arrangements, which are heavily regulated in Maryland real estate. A licensee must prioritize client interests and adhere strictly to disclosure requirements to maintain ethical standards and avoid regulatory violations. The challenge lies in structuring compensation in a way that is both fair to the licensee and fully understood and agreed upon by the client, without creating undue influence or misrepresentation. Correct approach analysis. The best professional practice involves clearly defining all commission structures and fee arrangements in writing, in advance of any services being rendered, and obtaining explicit client consent. This approach ensures full transparency and compliance with Maryland real estate law, which mandates written agreements for compensation, protects both the client by ensuring they understand all financial obligations and the licensee by establishing a clear, legally sound basis for their earnings. This proactive disclosure and agreement prevent misunderstandings and potential disputes. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach involves verbally agreeing to a commission split with a cooperating brokerage without documenting it in the listing agreement or a separate written addendum signed by the seller. This violates Maryland regulations, requiring all commission agreements to be in writing and signed by the parties involved. It creates ambiguity and leaves room for disputes, potentially exposing the licensee to disciplinary action for failing to adhere to disclosure and agreement requirements. Another incorrect approach is to inform the seller that a portion of the commission will be donated to a charity of the seller's choice only after the sale has closed and the commission has been received. This is problematic because it lacks pre-agreement and written documentation. Maryland law emphasizes transparency and requires disclosure of all fee arrangements upfront. Such a post-closing donation could be construed as a kickback or an undisclosed fee reduction, potentially violating regulations regarding honest dealing and disclosure of compensation. A third incorrect approach is to suggest to the buyer that the seller's agent will reduce their commission if the buyer uses the seller's agent to represent them in purchasing another property. This creates a clear conflict of interest and violates the principle of undivided loyalty owed to the seller. Furthermore, it constitutes an undisclosed fee arrangement with the buyer and potentially misrepresents the commission structure to the seller. Maryland regulations prohibit dual agency without informed written consent and require clear disclosure of all compensation arrangements. Professional reasoning. Professionals should always prioritize clear, written agreements for all commission structures and fee arrangements. This involves discussing all potential compensation with clients at the outset, documenting these discussions in legally binding agreements, and obtaining explicit consent. When dealing with cooperating brokerages or potential charitable contributions, these details must be incorporated into the primary agreement or a signed addendum before any services are performed or commissions are earned. Any situation that could create a conflict of interest or involve undisclosed compensation should be avoided or, if permissible, handled with extreme transparency and written consent from all parties. Question 17. The monitoring system demonstrates a Maryland real estate licensee is preparing to enter into a listing agreement with a seller. The seller has expressed a desire for comprehensive marketing efforts and is seeking assurance that their brokerage will be compensated for their work, even if the seller independently finds a buyer. Which type of listing agreement best aligns with these seller expectations and Maryland's regulatory framework for brokerage compensation? Option A, an exclusive right to sell listing agreement, which guarantees the listing broker a commission if the property sells during the listing period, regardless of who procures the buyer. Option B, a net listing agreement, where the seller agrees to accept a specified net amount for the property, and the broker's commission is any amount received above that net. Option C, an open listing agreement, where the seller can list the property with multiple brokers and only owes a commission to the broker who successfully procures a buyer. Option D, an exclusive agency listing agreement, where the seller owes a commission to the listing broker unless the seller procures the buyer themselves. The correct answer is A, an exclusive right to sell listing agreement, which guarantees the listing broker a commission if the property sells during the listing period, regardless of who procures the buyer. Explanation. The monitoring system demonstrates a common challenge in real estate practice, navigating the nuances of listing agreements to ensure compliance and client satisfaction. A Maryland real estate licensee must understand the distinct obligations and rights associated with each type of listing agreement to properly advise their clients and avoid potential disputes or regulatory violations. The challenge lies in accurately identifying the client's intent and the broker's responsibilities under the chosen agreement, especially when faced with differing market conditions or client preferences. The best approach involves clearly defining the scope of the broker's exclusive rights and the seller's obligations within the chosen listing agreement, ensuring it aligns with the client's stated goals and the broker's service commitment. This means selecting the agreement that best reflects the level of marketing effort the broker is willing to undertake and the seller's desire for exclusivity in compensation. For an exclusive right to sell listing, this involves the broker earning a commission regardless of who procures the buyer, provided the sale occurs during the listing period. This aligns with the Maryland Real Estate Commission's emphasis on clear contractual terms and the protection of brokerage services rendered. An incorrect approach would be to present an open listing to a seller who desires a high level of proactive marketing and dedicated representation. This type of agreement, while legally permissible, offers the least incentive for a broker to invest significant resources, as compensation is only earned if the broker is the procuring cause of the sale. This can lead to a lack of dedicated effort and potential dissatisfaction for the seller, and may not fully meet the expectations of a seller seeking comprehensive brokerage services. Another incorrect approach would be to misrepresent the terms of an exclusive agency listing. In this agreement, the broker earns a commission unless the seller procures the buyer independently. If the broker fails to clearly explain this distinction, or if the seller misunderstands that they can sell the property themselves without owing a commission, it creates a significant ethical and potentially legal issue. This lack of transparency violates the duty of full disclosure and can lead to disputes over earned commissions. Finally, presenting an exclusive right to sell listing without fully explaining that the broker is entitled to a commission, even if the seller finds the buyer themselves, is also an incorrect approach. While this is the defining characteristic of an exclusive right to sell, a failure to explicitly communicate this to the seller, especially if they express a desire to market the property independently, can lead to a perception of unfairness and a breach of the duty to ensure informed consent. Professionals should adopt a decision-making process that prioritizes client education and clear communication. This involves thoroughly discussing the implications of each listing agreement type, understanding the seller's specific needs and expectations, and recommending the agreement that best serves those needs while aligning with the broker's capacity and commitment. A consultative approach, where the licensee acts as an advisor rather than just a contract presenter, is crucial for ethical and successful transactions in Maryland. Question 18. Investigation of a property sale in Maryland reveals that the seller is also a licensed real estate salesperson. The salesperson representing the buyer is aware that the seller has made some verbal assurances about the property's condition, but has not yet provided a formal written disclosure statement. What is the most appropriate course of action for the buyer's salesperson to ensure compliance with Maryland real estate law and ethical practice? Option A. Obtain a comprehensive written disclosure statement from the seller detailing all known material defects and ensure it is promptly provided to the buyer, while also advising the buyer to conduct independent inspections. Option B. Accept the seller's verbal assurances and proceed with the transaction, focusing solely on the buyer's offer without further inquiry into the seller's disclosure obligations. Option C. Advise the buyer that since the seller is a licensee, a separate written disclosure statement is not legally required in this specific transaction. Option D. Proceed with the transaction based on the seller's verbal assurances, assuming their licensee status implies full knowledge and disclosure of all material defects. The correct answer is A. Obtain a comprehensive written disclosure statement from the seller detailing all known material defects and ensure it is promptly provided to the buyer, while also advising the buyer to conduct independent inspections. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a common challenge in Maryland real estate transactions, where a licensee must navigate the disclosure obligations of a seller who is also a licensee. The professional challenge lies in ensuring full compliance with Maryland's disclosure laws while respecting the seller's rights and the fiduciary duties owed to all parties. The complexity arises from the dual role of the seller as both a principal in the transaction and a licensed real estate professional, potentially creating conflicts of interest or perceived impropriety if not handled with utmost transparency and adherence to regulations. Careful judgment is required to balance the seller's personal interest with the legal and ethical obligations of the representing licensee. Correct approach analysis. The best professional practice involves the licensee meticulously documenting the seller's disclosure of all known material defects in writing, as required by Maryland law, and then ensuring these disclosures are promptly and fully provided to the prospective buyer. This approach is correct because Maryland Real Estate Commission regulations mandate that sellers disclose known material defects. When the seller is also a licensee, they are held to an even higher standard of knowledge and disclosure. The representing licensee's role is to facilitate this disclosure process accurately and transparently, ensuring the buyer is fully informed, thereby fulfilling the licensee's duty to the buyer and upholding the integrity of the transaction. This aligns with the principle of honest dealing and the requirement for full disclosure of all material facts that could affect a buyer's decision. Incorrect approaches analysis. Relying solely on the seller's verbal assurance of no known defects without obtaining a written disclosure statement is a significant regulatory failure. Maryland law requires written disclosure of known material defects. This approach bypasses a crucial legal safeguard and leaves the buyer vulnerable and the licensee potentially liable for misrepresentation or failure to disclose. Assuming that because the seller is a licensee, they are automatically aware of and will disclose all material defects, and therefore no specific written disclosure is necessary from the seller to the buyer, is also a failure. The seller's licensee status implies a higher awareness. It does not negate the statutory requirement for a formal disclosure document to be provided to the buyer in a transaction where they are the principal. The representing licensee still has a duty to ensure this process is followed. Accepting the seller's disclosure statement without independently verifying its completeness or advising the buyer to conduct their own inspections is also problematic. While the seller is responsible for their disclosures, the representing licensee has a duty to the buyer to ensure they are aware of the importance of thorough due diligence, including professional inspections, and that the seller's disclosures are presented clearly. This approach risks the licensee appearing to endorse incomplete or potentially misleading information. Professional reasoning. Professionals should approach such situations by prioritizing clear, written communication and strict adherence to statutory disclosure requirements. The decision-making process should involve 1. Understanding the specific disclosure obligations under Maryland law for all parties, especially when a seller is also a licensee. 2. Ensuring all disclosures are in writing and accurately reflect the seller's knowledge. 3. Promptly and fully transmitting these disclosures to the buyer. 4. Advising the buyer on the importance of independent inspections and professional advice. 5. Maintaining meticulous records of all communications and disclosures. This systematic approach mitigates risk and upholds ethical and legal standards. Question 19. Comparative studies suggest that efficient commission calculation is paramount for brokerage success. A property in Baltimore, Maryland, sells for $500,000. The listing agreement stipulates a total commission of 6% of the sale price, with 50% of the total commission going to the listing brokerage. The buyer's agent, who is part of a different brokerage, is to receive 5% of the sale price. Additionally, the listing agent negotiated a $10,000 seller concession for the buyer, which is deducted from the seller's proceeds before the final commission calculation is made on the net amount. How much commission does the buyer's agent's brokerage receive? Option A, $14,100. Option B, $13,250. Option C, $12,500. Option D, $15,000. Correct answer is C, $12,500. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a common challenge in real estate brokerage, accurately calculating commission splits when multiple agents are involved, especially when dealing with varying commission rates and potential referral fees. Miscalculations can lead to disputes, financial losses for agents, and damage to the brokerage reputation, potentially violating Maryland real estate license law regarding fair dealing and accurate representation of financial terms. Professional judgment is required to ensure all contractual obligations and statutory requirements are met. Correct approach analysis. The best approach involves meticulously breaking down the total commission based on the agreed-upon listing agreement terms, and then applying the cooperating broker's commission percentage to the seller's net proceeds after any agreed-upon seller concessions or closing costs that reduce the gross sale price before commission calculation. This method ensures that the cooperating broker's commission is calculated on the actual amount the seller receives after specific deductions, aligning with standard brokerage practices and Maryland's emphasis on clear and accurate financial disclosures. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach is to simply apply the cooperating broker's percentage to the gross sale price without considering any seller concessions or specific deductions outlined in the listing agreement. This fails to account for the actual net proceeds available for commission distribution and could result in an overpayment to the cooperating broker or a shortfall for the listing broker, violating the principle of accurate financial accounting and potentially breaching the listing agreement. Another incorrect approach is to deduct all closing costs from the gross sale price before calculating the cooperating broker's commission. While some costs might reduce the seller's net, the listing agreement typically specifies how commission is calculated, and not all closing costs are necessarily deducted prior to commission calculation. This method misinterprets the basis for commission calculation and could lead to an inaccurate split, potentially causing financial disputes and violating the terms of the brokerage agreement. A further incorrect approach is to assume a flat referral fee percentage based on industry norms without verifying the specific agreement between the cooperating broker and the listing agent. Referral fees must be clearly defined and agreed upon in writing. Calculating based on an assumption, rather than a documented agreement, can lead to disputes and may not comply with Maryland's requirements for clear contractual terms and prohibitions against undisclosed compensation arrangements. Professional reasoning. Professionals should always refer to the executed listing agreement and any separate agreements with cooperating brokers or referring parties. A step-by-step calculation, clearly documenting each deduction and percentage application, is crucial. When in doubt, seeking clarification from the brokerage principal or legal counsel is advisable to ensure compliance with Maryland real estate laws and ethical standards.